They took her husband in April. They took her name off the mailbox in June. They took her last $300 in July. And she still went back to open the diner. She found the popcorn tin behind the pie case. She started counting tiles. The lawyer called her Mrs. Reyes twice before she stopped correcting him. Roger Pruitt's men were already measuring the parking lot, before the funeral flowers even wilted. Then, on a Tuesday morning, pie server in hand, she pried up a cracked piece of linoleum. It had no business being loose. Underneath was a hole. It had been waiting for her since before she was born. But before the tin, there was the lawyer's office. And the paper, he slid across the table. The lawyer slid the paper across the table. "Your father left you the diner, Mrs. Reyes," he said, "and that's all he left you." Callie didn't correct him. Her name was Whitmore again. Grief had already taken more from her than a word. She was 29, 11 months a widow. Danny had been dead since April. A rain-slick curve on the Cumberland Parkway. A state trooper had told her about it in a voice so gentle it made her want to scream. She hadn't screamed. She'd signed the papers he handed her. Then the papers after that. Signing papers had started to feel like the only thing her hand still knew how to do. "I understand you were married," the lawyer said, checking a form. "Reyes?" "Whitmore," Callie said. "I went back to Whitmore." He nodded like it didn't matter. In his office, it didn't. Her father's whole estate came down to a 5-page will and a half-acre of gravel on Route 9. The lawyer read it fast and flat, like a grocery list. Because to him, it was one. Ray Whitmore, deceased, left one 1974 Ford truck to his brother in Ohio. He left his tools to the volunteer fire department. And he left the diner, the building, and the crawl space under it to his daughter, Callie Jean, for the sum of $1. So there'd be no probate delay. No argument among people who weren't there to argue, because there was no one left to argue. "That's it," Callie said. "That's the estate," the lawyer said. He slid a dollar bill across the table with the paper, like it was a joke they were both supposed to laugh at. She didn't laugh. She folded the dollar into her coat pocket and walked out. A man in a golf shirt stood in the parking lot with a clipboard, measuring the frontage of the lot next door. His tape clicked every time he let it retract. Callie didn't know his name yet. She'd learn it soon enough. His name was Roger Pruitt. He had a $2,600,000 handshake deal with a truck stop chain. Every foot of ground between the coal depot and the county line was riding on it. He looked at the Whitmore diner the way a man looks at a weed in a garden he's already sold. Her sister Denise was waiting in the truck. "Well," Denise said. "He left me the diner," Callie said. "For $1. Denise laughed, short and disbelieving. "The diner's been closed 3 years, Cal. Dad let the health permit lapse. There's nothing in there but dust and a busted walk-in." "I know," Callie said. She looked at the folded dollar like it was heavier than it was. She'd grown up behind that counter. She could still set a table blind. She still knew which booth had the wobble in the third leg. She still remembered exactly how her father tipped the coffee pot. A precise 45-degree angle so it never dripped no matter how fast he poured. He taught her that at 9 years old, standing on a milk crate so she could reach. She still did it that way. Alone in her sister's kitchen, pouring coffee, no one was watching her pour. Some things a body keeps even after there's no one left to notice. $340. That was what sat in her checking account the morning after the reading. After rent to Denise. After the truck stop shift differential that made her check almost livable. After 11 months of grief that had eaten every soft place in her life. The way water eats a foundation from underneath. Quiet until the day the whole thing gives. She went back to the diner on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were slow at the truck stop, and she couldn't stop thinking about the smell of the place. Coffee and bacon grease and pine sol, baked into the walls for 31 years. The key still worked. Her father had never changed the locks, not once. The door groaned the exact same groan it always had. Like the building itself was clearing its throat. Dust. 3 years of it, grey and even, over every booth and stool. The pie case stood empty, its glass fogged with grime. The grill was cold enough to feel like it had never once been hot. And on the wall behind the register, right where he'd hung it every day she could remember, was her father's photograph next to her mother's. The two of them squinting into a sun that had set a long time ago. Ray Whitmore had died 3 years earlier. His heart finally quit keeping up with him, in a hospital bed with tubes running into both arms. Callie had sat beside him for the last of it. Danny had driven her there himself and held her hand in the waiting room until the nurse came out. The week before he died, feverish and half somewhere else, Ray gripped her wrist with a strength that startled her. He said the only thing he ever said about the diner that wasn't about grease traps or the price of eggs. "I didn't leave you a diner, Cal," he said, his voice thin as paper. "I left you the only key that matters. Count the tiles, not the years." She thought it was fever talk. Dying men said strange things, the nurses had told her, gently, like it was supposed to comfort her. She held his hand and told him to rest. 3 days later, he was gone. She never once thought about that sentence again. Not until she was standing in his empty diner with a dollar bill in her pocket. Nowhere else in the world felt like it belonged to her. She ran a rag over the counter, more habit than purpose. Somewhere under the grime, the formica still had its old cream and rust pattern, the one that went out of style before she was in kindergarten and never came back. Not that her father would have cared. He'd bought the diner in 1994 with money nobody in the family understood him having, and he'd run it exactly the way he wanted for 31 years, feeding truckers and church ladies and the volunteer fire crew off the same laminated menu he never once updated. She was down on one knee, scrubbing at a stubborn patch by the pie case, when her boot caught on something. A tile, cracked clean through. Its edge lifted maybe a quarter-inch above its neighbour's, like it had been loosened rather than broken. She pressed it with 2 fingers. It rocked slightly. Nothing in a floor sealed for decades should rock like that. She thought of 11 cracked tiles. She'd counted them without meaning to, years ago, bored on a stool while her father worked the grill. The same 11 tiles between the register and the pie case that had always been just a little uneven underfoot. She'd once asked her father about it. "Old building settles funny, baby," he'd said, and changed the subject to whether she wanted a milkshake. Count the tiles, not the years. Her stomach did something complicated. She told herself it was nothing. An old man's dying delirium, latching onto a flaw he happened to be thinking about. She kept scrubbing. She told herself that for almost 4 minutes. Then she got up, got the pie server from the drawer where it had always lived, and knelt back at the loose tile. Her heart was going harder than the task called for. The tile came up easier than it should have. Underneath wasn't subfloor. It was a shallow crawl space, maybe 8 inches deep, dry and clean, in a way 3 years of abandonment had no business leaving anything. Sitting in the middle of it, waiting, was a rusted popcorn tin. Her hands shook when she lifted it out. It was lighter than she expected. Something shifted inside with a small metallic sound. For one long second, Callie Jean Whitmore knelt on the floor of her dead father's diner and did not open it. Some part of her already understood. Whatever was inside that tin was going to change which direction her whole life pointed. She wanted one more breath of the life she'd had before she knew. Then she pried the lid. Inside was a brass key, small and old-fashioned, taped to a folded receipt gone soft and brown with age. Under that, folded twice, a scrap of paper in her father's handwriting. 4 words. Nothing more. For Cal. Count carefully. She sat back on her heels on the dusty floor and laughed. Once. A sound with no humour in it at all. Her father had been dead 3 years, and he'd just spoken to her again, as clearly as if he were standing behind the grill. She didn't know yet what the key opened. She didn't know about Roger Pruitt's banknote, or his truck stop deal, or the 40 feet of frontage that would decide whose signature meant anything at all. She didn't know a county surveyor named Wendell Pruitt had filed a map 40 years ago that he still remembered line by line. She only knew she was holding a key her father had wanted her, specifically, to find. The diner everyone in her family called Worthless had just told her something, in the only language Ray Whitmore ever really spoke, that it wasn't finished talking yet. She put the tin in her coat pocket, next to the folded dollar bill. She looked around the dusty room the way you look at a person you're only just now realising you underestimated. "Okay, Dad," she said out loud. "To no one. I'm counting." Outside, past the fogged front window, a man with a clipboard stood at the property line again, tape measure clicking, already certain of everything he thought he knew about a half-acre of gravel and a dead man's daughter. He had no idea what she'd just found. She'd need more than a pie server to open a floor safe, if that's what the key belonged to. She'd need someone who remembered this building before it was a diner at all, before it was anything, back when the concrete was still wet, when a much younger Ray Whitmore stood over it with a man from the county, deciding exactly what to bury and where. She thought of one name. Wendell Pruitt had surveyed half the parcels on Route 9 in his life. He'd known her father since before Callie was born. If anyone in Marrow Creek could tell her what a 30-year-old key was supposed to fit, it was him. She locked the diner door behind her, the same groan as always. For the first time in 11 months, Callie Jean Whitmore walked to her truck with something other than grief sitting in her chest. It wasn't hope yet. It was smaller than hope. It was a question. And questions, she was starting to remember, were the first thing that ever felt like being alive again. Denise was still parked at the curb, waiting, the truck's engine idling low. "You look different," Denise said when Callie climbed in. "I found something," Callie said. She didn't say anything else the whole ride to Wendell Pruitt's house. Some things you don't explain until you understand them yourself. And Callie Jean Whitmore, for the first time since April, had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to her. She liked it better that way. Wendell Pruitt's house sat at the end of a gravel drive off Kettle Road. A low brick rambler, a flagpole in the yard, a shop out back where he still kept his old surveying equipment. Oiled and organised, like a man who never quite let go of the work, even after the work let go of him. He was 71, broad through the shoulders, the way men get when decades of field work never quite leave the body. He answered the door in a flannel shirt, a pencil still tucked behind one ear out of 40 years of habit. "Callie Whitmore," he said, before she'd said a word. "Lord, you've got your mother's whole face." "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "I need to ask you something about my dad's diner." Something crossed his expression. Quick and careful. The look of a man deciding how much of an old secret he was allowed to spend. "You'd better come in," he said, "and you'd better bring whatever's in your pocket that's making you hold your coat like that." She hadn't realised she was holding it. She followed him inside anyway, the popcorn tin heavy against her hip. She had the strange, settling feeling that whatever Wendell Pruitt knew, he'd been waiting a long time for someone to finally come ask him. "Your daddy," Wendell said, easing into a kitchen chair across from her, "was not a man who did things by accident. Whatever you found in that floor, he put it there on purpose. He put it there so only you would find it. Now, show me the key." Callie set the tin on Wendell Pruitt's kitchen table. She lifted the key out with 2 fingers, like it might still be hot from wherever it had been sleeping. Wendell picked it up. He turned it once in the light. He went quiet in a way that told Callie more than any sentence could have. "That's a floor-safe key," he said finally. "Old Diebold pattern. The kind they quit making sometime in the 80s. Your daddy didn't buy this recent. He set it down like it was delicate. I filed the original parcel map for that diner in 1994, Callie. I was 38 years old, still had both knees working right. Your daddy paid me to come out before the foundation pour, to mark exactly where he wanted a few things buried in the concrete." "A safe," Callie said. "A safe," Wendell agreed. "Bolted into the footing itself, not sitting on top of it. You'd need a jackhammer to move it. That's the point. He told me this and I remember it because it struck me odd at the time. He said, 'Wendell, someday somebody's going to try and take this place off my girl. And when they do, I want the ground itself to fight for her.'" Callie's eyes stung. She hadn't cried in front of anyone since the funeral, not even Denise. She wasn't about to start in Wendell Pruitt's kitchen. But something in her chest cracked open half an inch and let a little light in. "He knew," she said. "Even back then, he knew somebody'd come for it." "Your daddy," Wendell said, "was the kind of man who planned for the flood before the sky went dark. Now get your coat. If that key fits what I think it fits, we're going to need better light than a diner window in October." They drove back to Route 9 in Wendell's truck, an old flashlight rattling in the door pocket. The diner looked exactly the same from the outside, sagging gutter and all. And no different than it had looked to Roger Pruitt's men that morning, standing at the property line with their clicking tape and their certainty. Inside, Wendell knelt at the open crawl space with a grunt. It told Callie exactly how old his knees actually were. He ran his flashlight along the edges of the hole. "There," he said. "See the seam in the concrete? Right there? Where it doesn't quite match the pour around it? That's not settling. That's a second pour. Poured after the first one cured. sealing something in. He tapped it with a screwdriver he'd brought from his truck. It rang hollow where the rest of the floor rang solid. It took the better part of an hour. Wendell directing, Callie doing the actual kneeling and prying. Finally, they'd cleared enough of the false pour to expose a rectangle of grey steel set flush into the true foundation. A floor safe, exactly as Wendell had said. Its face was pitted with age, but its keyhole was clean, like someone had oiled it more recently than 3 years ago. Somebody's been maintaining this, Callie said. Your daddy, Wendell said. Man serviced that lock every year of his life. I'd bet money. Go on, it's your key. Her hand shook enough that it took her 2 tries to get it in. The tumblers turned with a sound like a held breath finally letting go. The safe door swung open on a hinge that had clearly been oiled far more recently than the rest of the building's hardware. Inside sat a sealed steel lockbox. Beside it sat a stack of savings bonds, wrapped in a plastic sleeve gone brittle with age. A rubber band held them. It crumbled the second Callie touched it. She lifted the lockbox out first. It wasn't locked, just latched. Inside she found the diner's original deed, a second folded document she didn't recognise, and a leather ledger, her father's handwriting crowding every line of its early pages. Wendell went very still. The way a man goes still when he's doing arithmetic, he doesn't want to say out loud yet. Those bonds, he said slowly, if they're what I think they are. Series issued back in the 90s, matured and still sitting, untouched. 30 years of interest compounding on them. He picked up the deed, he adjusted his glasses, he read it twice. Callie, this isn't just a half acre the diner sits on. What do you mean? Wendell set the deed down flat on the counter. He traced a line on it with one thick finger. This describes the parcel boundary running 40 feet past where the current county survey has it. Your daddy's original 1994 filing, the one I did myself, puts your frontage 40 feet deeper than anybody's been counting it for years. Callie didn't understand yet what that meant in dollars, but she understood the look on Wendell Pruitt's face. It was the look of a man who had just realised a decades-old secret was about to become very loud. 40 feet doesn't sound like much, she said. Wendell laughed, short and disbelieving, not unlike the sound Denise had made in the truck that morning. Except this laugh had something else underneath it. Something like awe. 40 feet of road frontage on that stretch. With what's coming through here. Callie, that's the difference between a dead man's diner and the single most valuable half acre on this whole stretch. He was quiet a moment, doing the math a surveyor does automatically out of 40 years of habit. Whoever's trying to buy up this corridor, Wendell said, and somebody clearly is. I've seen the same golf shirt fella out here twice myself. They're planning their whole assembly on your property line sitting where the current county map says it sits. But if your daddy's original filing is the true one, and I filed it myself so I know it is, then a big piece of what they think they're buying next door actually belongs to you. Callie sat down hard in the diner's one remaining stool. The vinyl was cracked and cold under her. She looked at the deed like it might vanish if she blinked. How much? She said. Just tell me straight, Mr. Pruitt. How much are we talking? Wendell studied the parcel numbers a moment longer. He was cross-referencing something in his head, the kind of estimate 40 years of surveying county land teaches a man to make. With that frontage confirmed, he said finally, and knowing what that developer's planning for a bypass exchange out here, I'd put the land alone, just the land, north of $2 million. Maybe higher, once the state's road plans go final. He looked up at her. Your daddy's whole rest of the estate, the truck, the tools, everything else, wasn't worth $10,000 combined. This, sitting under a cracked floor tile, is worth more than everything else he owned. Times 200. Callie put both hands over her mouth. Not from joy exactly, from something closer to vertigo. The specific dizziness of a woman who has spent 11 months learning to live on $340. Suddenly told the ground under her feet is worth more than she could earn in 4 lifetimes at a truck stop register. He never said a word, she whispered. 31 years and he never said a word. Some men don't talk about the flood, Wendell said quietly. They just build the boat and hand you the oar when it's time. They sat with that a moment, the two of them, in a diner that had been declared worthless by a lawyer that same morning. Callie opened the ledger to its first page. She began for the first time to read her father's handwriting. the way you read a letter from someone who has just come back from somewhere very far away. The early entries were ordinary: grease trap service, a new compressor for the walk-in, payroll for 2 waitresses whose names she half remembered from childhood summers behind the counter. But halfway down the second page, in a hand that was not her father's, someone else had made an entry, neat and careful, a different slant to the letters entirely. V. Whitmore, cosigner, it read, next to a column of figures that ran 3 years deep before the handwriting stopped. Callie stared at it a long moment. "Mr. Pruitt," she said slowly. "My mother died before this diner ever opened. That's what Dad always told me. She died when I was 2. Wendell's face did something complicated. The look of a man weighing whether an old truth was his to tell. "Callie," he said gently, "I think there's more in that ledger than your daddy ever meant for you to read all at once. But since you've already started, I expect you'd best keep going." Before she could ask him what he meant, headlights swept across the diner's front window. Twice, slow, like someone checking whether the building was occupied. Callie looked up in time to see a black pickup idle at the property line for a long moment before pulling away. She didn't know it yet, but the man behind that wheel had just watched Wendell Pruitt's truck parked outside a diner he'd assumed was empty and abandoned. He did not like what that meant at all. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at Denise's house, addressed to Callie Jean Whitmore, postmarked from a development office 2 towns over. Inside was a single typed page, and at the bottom of it, a number, $9,000. For the whole parcel, building included as a courtesy to the family during this difficult time. Signed Roger Pruitt, Pruitt Regional Development. Callie read it twice, then she folded it back into its envelope. For the first time in 11 months, she felt something that was not grief and was not fear either. It felt more than anything like a particular calm. The calm of a woman who has just learned exactly how much someone is willing to lie to her face. And exactly why. "He wants it fast," she said to Denise, sliding the letter across the table the way the lawyer had slid his. "That means he needs it fast. And a man who needs something fast is a man you can afford to make wait." Callie did not answer Roger Pruitt's letter. She left it on Denise's kitchen table for 3 days, where it sat like a dare. Instead, she went back to the ledger. The handwriting that wasn't her father's ran through the diner's books for exactly 10 years, 1994 to 2004. Careful and looping. Tracking every dollar in and every dollar out with a precision Ray Whitmore's own scrawl never quite matched. Payroll. Suppliers. A running note sat in the margin, in that same hand. It read simply, "County fee, paid in full, filed personally," next to a date in March of 1994. "Mr. Pruitt," Callie said when she called him that evening, the ledger open on her lap, "I need you to tell me the truth about my mother." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Callie thought the call had dropped. "Your mother," Wendell said finally, "was named Vera Ann Whitmore, and she did not die when you were 2, Callie. She died when you were 12 in the spring, an illness she'd been fighting quiet for a long while, because that's how your family did things. Quiet." Callie's hand went still on the page. "Dad told me she died before the diner opened. He told me that my whole life. I expect he told you that," Wendell said, "because it hurt less than the truth. The truth is your mother ran half that diner's business alongside him for 10 years, kept books sharper than any accountant in this county, and paid the recording fee on the original parcel filing herself, out of her own purse, the week you were born. Because your daddy was too proud to ask the county for a favour and too broke to pay it twice. Why would he lie to me about when she died?" Wendell's voice, when it came again, was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Grief does strange arithmetic, Callie. Some men can carry a wife's death easier if they tell themselves, and everyone else, that it happened further back than it did. So the wound gets to be an old one instead of a fresh one, every single day. I think your daddy needed you to believe she was gone before the good years, so you wouldn't spend your whole childhood watching him miss her at the register every morning." Callie sat with the phone against her ear a long moment, looking at her mother's careful handwriting. 10 years of a life she'd never been told existed. "She built this with him," Callie said slowly. "The frontage, the filing fee, all of it. It wasn't just his." "No," Wendell agreed. "It was never just his. which means if you want to look at it plain, that fortune sitting under your floor is half your mother's making. She's the one who made sure the county fee got paid. So the filing would stand up. All these years later, exactly the way it's standing up now. Something in Callie shifted that night. Quiet but permanent. The particular reordering that happens when a person learns their history is bigger and stranger and more loving than they'd been told. She had spent 11 months believing she had lost everyone who ever built anything for her. She had not known, until that evening, that she had lost 2 people who built something for her, not one. And that the second one had been hiding in a margin note the whole time, waiting for her to finally read carefully enough to find her. She did not sleep much. She spent the rest of the night with the ledger. Near 2 a.m, she found, tucked into the ledger's back cover, a folded paper she'd missed the first time. The county's original 1994 filing stamp. An ink impression gone faint with age, but still legible if you held it to the light. Dated and sealed 2 full years before the county's own boundary survey had been conducted, 2 years earlier. Wendell had told her the parcel description ran 40 feet past the current map. Now she understood why nobody had ever caught the discrepancy. The county's boundary survey, the one everyone in Marrow Creek assumed was the final word, had simply never accounted for it. For a filing that predated it by 2 years. A filing that had been sitting, correctly recorded, in a diner floor safe the entire time. She called Wendell again in the morning. This time he didn't sound surprised at all. "That's the corroborator," he said. "That's the piece that turns a claim into a fact. You've got the deed itself, your daddy's copy, and now you've got the county's own stamp proving it was filed and recorded before anybody's boundary survey. Callie, that's not a story anymore. That's a record. What do I do with it?" "You wait," Wendell said. "You let the man with the banknote behind him make the next move. Men in a hurry always do." Roger Pruitt made his next move 8 days later. And it was not another letter. Callie learned about it from Denise. Denise had heard it from a woman at church, who'd heard it from her cousin at the county courthouse. Roger Pruitt had filed a hardship petition with the town zoning board, requesting an emergency eminent domain review of the Whitmore parcel, citing blight, extended vacancy, and public safety concerns. A hearing date had been set for 3 weeks out, at the Marrow Creek Town Hall, open to the public. "He's trying to take it through the town instead of buying it from you," Denise said, reading the notice over Callie's shoulder. "Cal, can he actually do that? Just decide your building's a hazard and take it." "He can try," Callie said. There was something in her voice that hadn't been there 11 months ago, something that sounded for the first time since April, almost like her old self. But he's trying it because he's out of time, not because he thinks it'll work. A man who was sure of his ground wouldn't need to hurry a town board into a decision in 3 weeks. She called Wendell that same afternoon. "He's filed for a hardship review," she told him. "Zoning board, 3 weeks. Then we've got 3 weeks to make sure the board has the right map in front of it." "When they vote," Wendell said. "Instead of the wrong one everyone in this county's been using for 40 years. Get your coat, Callie. We're going to the courthouse." The Marrow Creek County Records Office occupied the basement of the old courthouse on Main Street, low-ceilinged, lined with steel shelving that held 4 decades of plat books, deed transfers, and boundary surveys, most of them untouched in years except by title companies doing routine searches. Wendell walked the aisles like a man walking through his own memory, pulling books from shelves without needing to check the spines. "Here," he said finally, laying a heavy-bound volume open on the reading table, its pages yellowed at the edges. 1994 filings, March through June. "I know exactly what week we're looking for. I remember the week I did the survey. Your daddy paid me in pie." Callie almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between grief and gratitude. Then Wendell's finger stopped on a page, and he went quiet the same way he'd gone quiet over the deed in the diner. "There," he said. "March 14th, 1994. Filing number, parcel description. The exact 40 feet of frontage your daddy's deed describes. Recorded and stamped 2 full years before the county conducted its next boundary survey in 1996. The survey everybody's been treating as gospel ever since." He looked up at her. "This is the county's own book, Callie. Their own record. It says what your daddy's deed says. It's not a family story anymore. It's public record, sitting exactly where it's been sitting the whole time, waiting for somebody to open the right book. The records clerk was a heavy-set man named Delbert Combs. He'd worked that basement for going on 20 years. He wandered over at the sound of Wendell's voice. He peered at the page over his glasses. "Pruitt," Delbert said, recognizing him immediately. "Didn't figure I'd see you down here again. You retired, 12 years back?" 14, Wendell said. "But some maps you don't forget just because you stopped getting paid to remember them." Delbert looked at the page, then at Callie, then back at the page. Something in his expression sharpened. "That's the Whitmore parcel," he said slowly. "Fella came in here 2 weeks ago asking about that exact property. Golf shirt. Kept asking real particular questions about the boundary line, like he already had an answer he wanted the map to agree with." "Did it?" Callie asked. Delbert almost smiled. "No, ma'am. It did not." Wendell had the records office make a certified copy of the 1994 filing on the spot. Delbert stamped it himself with a seal that had recorded truth in that county for 2 decades. Callie folded it carefully into a manila envelope alongside her father's original deed. She understood for the first time exactly what shape her victory was going to take. Not a fight, not a confrontation in a parking lot with a man in a golf shirt. A reading, a quiet, procedural, undeniable reading of a document that had been true the entire time, in front of every person in Marrow Creek who thought they already knew how this story ended. 3 weeks, she said to Wendell, on the courthouse steps. 3 weeks, he agreed. Time enough for a man to keep digging himself in deeper, thinking that the ground under him is solid. Callie looked down Main Street toward the diner, invisible from here but close enough to feel. She thought of her mother's careful handwriting, and her father's dying instruction, and a coffee pot tipped at exactly 45 degrees so it never dripped. She felt something new. For the first time since a state trooper's gentle voice had ended her old life in April. Something that was allowed to feel almost like readiness. Roger Pruitt did not know that week that a certified copy of the 1994 filing already existed. He only knew a woman he'd expected to fold inside of 10 days had not answered his letter, had not called his office, and had, according to his site manager, been seen twice more at the diner, with an old man everyone in town still called the surveyor. He was 54, sharp-jawed, expensive haircut in a town that mostly didn't pay for haircuts. He'd built Pruitt Regional Development out of nothing but nerve, a knack for buying land nobody else wanted. Right at the moment it was about to become land everyone wanted. It had worked for 20 years. It had made him, on paper, a wealthy man. What it had not made him, this particular autumn, was liquid. His bank held a note on the land assembly, $1,800,000, drawn down against parcels he'd already closed. The note had a covenant in it, buried in paragraph 9, requiring full site assembly by the end of the calendar year, or the bank had the right to call the balance immediately. He was 3 payments into a grace period his loan officer had granted him as a personal favour, a favour that would not survive a second missed quarter, and the truck stop chain's $2,600,000 pre-sale agreement was itself contingent on delivering a contiguous parcel. A parcel that included, whether Roger wanted to admit it or not, the exact half-acre a dead man's daughter now owned outright. He drove to the diner himself on a Thursday evening. Alone, no clipboard this time. He found Callie inside with a rag in her hand, wiping down a counter that hadn't served a customer in 3 years. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, from the doorway using her name correctly this time, which told her he'd done his homework. "I was hoping we could talk without the lawyers for a minute." "You can talk," Callie said, not looking up from the counter. "I'm working." He came in anyway, glancing around the dusty room with an expression that tried for sympathy and landed somewhere closer to appraisal. "I know this must feel like a hard time to be dealing with any of this. Losing your father. I understand you lost your husband too. Not long before. That's a lot of grief to carry." "It is," Callie agreed, and kept wiping the counter. "My offer still stands," Roger said. $9,000, and I'll even cover your moving costs. Get you set up somewhere easier than a roadside diner that hasn't turned a profit in years. You could put that money towards something that actually helps you. A fresh start. Callie set the rag down. She looked at him for the first time since he'd walked in, and something in her calm unsettled him more than shouting would have. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "why do you want a dead diner so badly?" "Progress," he said smoothly. This whole corridor's about to change. I'm just trying to get ahead of it, same as any businessman would. Funny, Callie said, because I heard you've already signed a deal with a truck stop chain, contingent on this exact parcel closing by year's end. And I heard your bank's not going to be real patient if that deal falls through. She picked the rag back up. That doesn't sound like getting ahead of progress to me. That sounds like a man running out of road. Roger's jaw tightened just barely. The flicker of a man who has just realised the woman across the counter knows more than she's supposed to. Small towns talk, he said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. You shouldn't believe everything you hear. I don't, Callie said. I believe what's recorded. And what's recorded, Mr. Pruitt, might surprise you. She let that sit a moment, watching it land. She didn't explain further. Wendell had told her exactly this. Let a man in a hurry wonder what you know. Wondering does more damage than telling ever could. Roger left without pushing his offer any higher. Callie watched his taillights pull out onto Route 9. She understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that he'd just driven away more frightened than he'd arrived. She told Wendell about the visit the next morning, over coffee at his kitchen table. The ledger and the deed and the certified filing copy spread between them like a hand of cards she was finally learning how to hold. You didn't tell him what we found, Wendell said. Not quite a question. No, Callie said. You said let him wonder. Good girl, Wendell said, then caught himself. The old habit of a man who'd known her since she was small enough to sit on a milk crate. Good instinct, I mean. Your daddy had that same quiet. Never showed his hand till the exact moment it mattered. He didn't show me much of anything, Callie said. There was no bitterness in it anymore, just a tired kind of wonder. Not the safe. Not Mom, not any of it. He showed you the tiles, Wendell said gently. He showed you exactly enough to find the rest yourself when you were ready to. That's not nothing, Callie. That's a man trusting his daughter to be strong enough to do the finding. She thought about that the rest of the week. Turning it over the way she used to turn over Danny's old ball cap, back when she still let herself hold on to things that hurt to hold. She thought about her mother's careful handwriting, 10 years of ledger entries in a hand nobody had ever mentioned to her. She started for the first time since April to let herself imagine what her mother might have looked like standing behind that same register, tipping the same coffee pot at the same 45-degree angle, teaching Ray Whitmore the discipline he'd later teach his daughter. The hearing notice arrived the following Monday, official this time, mailed from the town clerk's office, setting the zoning board's session for the second Thursday of the next month, 7 o'clock in the evening, at the Marrow Creek Town Hall. Open session, public comment invited. Denise read it twice at the kitchen table. It says here they can vote to declare the property blighted, authorise an emergency purchase at assessed value if the board finds in the town's favour. Cal, assessed value on that parcel is basically nothing. They've had it on the books as a dollar transfer for weeks. I know what it says, Callie said. Are you scared? Callie considered the question honestly, the way she'd learned to consider most things since April, without flinching from whatever answer came. A little, she admitted, but I've got the deed, I've got the county's own stamp on a filing that predates their whole map by 2 years. I've got Wendell, who filed it himself and remembers every line of it. And I've got a mother I didn't know I had. She paid the recording fee herself so it would stand up exactly like this, 30 years later. In a room full of people who think they already know how this ends. She looked at the hearing notice a long moment. Then she folded it and set it beside her father's dollar bill, the one she still carried in her coat pocket, the one that had started this whole reckoning. Let them vote, she said. Let them think they're voting on a dead diner. I'll bring the map that says otherwise. In the 3 weeks before the hearing, Callie did not sit idle. She scrubbed the diner from the pie case to the grill, restocked the register with money she genuinely couldn't spare, reopened for 2 hours on a Saturday morning, with a hand-painted sign in the window that simply said, "Open," no explanation offered. 6 people came the first day, mostly out of curiosity, a few out of loyalty to a man they'd known 31 years. By the third Saturday, the number had grown to 20. Word moving through Marrow Creek, the way word always moves through small towns, quiet and certain, faster than any advertisement could manage. Wendell came by most mornings, ostensibly to check on the frontage stakes he'd driven along the property line, to mark the true boundary. But really, Callie understood, to make sure she wasn't carrying all of this alone. He brought his own coffee thermos and refused, every single time, to let her pour him a cup from the diner's pot. Not till you've got your health permit renewed, and not a day before. It made her laugh, genuinely laugh, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. Roger Pruitt, for his part, grew quieter as the hearing date approached. Quieter in a man used to talking his way through every obstacle was its own kind of tell. He did not come back to the diner. He did not send another letter. He spent an increasing number of hours at the bank 2 towns over. So said the same church grapevine that had first warned Callie about the zoning petition. In meetings that lasted longer each time, with a loan officer who had stopped smiling at him in the lobby. 2 nights before the hearing, Callie sat alone in the diner after closing, the popcorn tin on the counter beside her, her father's photograph watching from the wall. She read the 4 words on his last note to her, one more time. For Cal, count carefully. She thought of her mother's handwriting in the margin. 10 years of quiet partnership nobody had ever told her about. She understood finally that the Enigma line had never been about a flaw at all. It had been about her whole life. Count carefully. Look past what people tell you a thing is worth. Look underneath. She closed the diner, locked the door with its familiar groan. She drove to Wendell's house one last time before the hearing, to go over, item by item, exactly what they would say when the town of Marrow Creek finally opened the floor for public comment. The week after Roger Pruitt's visit to the diner, a second complication arrived. It did not come by mail. Callie was scrubbing the grill's hood vent, sleeves rolled to her elbows, when a woman she didn't recognise knocked on the propped open front door. She was perhaps 60, dressed neatly in a cardigan the colour of dried lavender, holding a manila folder against her chest like it might blow away. "Mrs. Whitmore," the woman said. "My name is Sharon Tolliver. I worked the register here, 20-some years back, when your mother still kept the books." Callie set down her rag. "You knew my mother." "I knew both your parents," Sharon said. "Vera trained me on this exact register, taught me how she liked the drawer counted twice at a close. Not because the math ever came out different, but because she said hope sometimes asked for a recount." She smiled, a little sadly. "I heard you'd reopened. I heard, through my niece who clerks at the courthouse, that there's some kind of dispute brewing over the property line. I thought you should have this." She held out the folder. Inside was a single photograph curled at the edges. It showed a much younger Ray Whitmore, and a woman with Callie's same eyes standing in front of a half-built diner. A survey stake was visible in the dirt beside them. A date scrawled on the back in pencil. March 1994. Vera insisted on that stake being driven exactly where the surveyor put it, Sharon said. "I remember because your father teased her about caring more for a piece of wood in the dirt than the paint colour inside. She told him, plain as anything, that the wood in the dirt was the only thing in this whole venture nobody could argue with later." Callie held the photograph a long moment, feeling the particular vertigo of seeing, for the first time, physical proof of a mother she had never been permitted to remember properly. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Callie asked, not unkindly. "Didn't know there was anything to come forward about," Sharon said. "Not till my niece mentioned the name Pruitt attached to a zoning filing. Once I heard that name, I remembered exactly which corner of this parcel your parents cared about most. I thought somebody besides me ought to know why." Callie thanked her. After Sharon left, she sat with the photograph a long while, turning it over in her hands before she called Wendell to tell him what she'd found. "That stake," Wendell said, once she'd described it. "Callie, I drove that stake myself the same week I filed the survey. If it's still marked in that photograph exactly where I think it was, that's a second, independent confirmation of the true boundary line, taken the same month as the filing, held by a witness who has no reason on earth to lie for you. Will it matter at the hearing?" "It might matter more than the filing itself," Wendell said. "Paper's paper." But a photograph of 2 people who are both gone now, standing exactly where the truth was staked into the ground, the same season they built this place. That's the kind of thing a room full of neighbours doesn't forget once they've seen it. Roger Pruitt, meanwhile, was not standing still. Callie learned it through the same church grapevine that had first warned her of the zoning petition. He'd sent a private appraiser out to walk the corridor twice more that week, that he'd quietly approached 2 other property owners on Route 9, offering above-market prices to lock down alternate frontage in case the Whitmore parcel slipped from his grasp entirely. It was, Wendell told her, the behaviour of a man building a second bridge, because he no longer trusted the first one to hold his weight. He's scared, Callie said. He's smart enough to be scared, Wendell said. That's worse for him than being foolish. A foolish man doesn't see the wall until he hits it. A scared man sees the wall and keeps driving toward it anyway. Because he's already spent the money that was supposed to get him past it. That same week, Callie drove 2 counties over, to the bank branch where her mother's old account records were still astonishingly retrievable. A teller who remembered the Whitmore name from a decades-old ledger transfer helped her track it down. It took most of an afternoon, and a manager's signature, but Callie left with a single printed statement showing a payment, dated March 1994, from an account held solely in Vera Ann Whitmore's name, made out to the Marrow Creek County Clerk's office, for the exact amount of a parcel recording fee. She sat in her truck in the bank parking lot afterward and cried, for the first time since the funeral. Not from grief exactly, though grief was woven through it. From something closer to gratitude, the specific ache of discovering that you were loved more thoroughly and more quietly than you had ever been permitted to know. You paid for all of it, she said out loud, to no one. The way she'd once said, "Okay, Dad, I'm counting," to an empty diner. You paid for the whole thing to still be true. 30 years later, and nobody ever told me your name. She drove home with the statement folded carefully into the same manila envelope that held the deed and the certified filing. That night she added Vera Whitmore's bank statement to the growing stack of proof. She understood finally that whatever happened at the hearing, she had already recovered something larger than a parcel of land. She had recovered a mother. Denise, watching her sort the documents at the kitchen table that evening, finally asked the question she'd been holding back for weeks. Do you forgive him? Dad, I mean. For not telling you, Callie considered it honestly. It did. I think he was trying to protect me from losing her twice, she said. Once when she died, and again every time somebody made him talk about it. I think grief made him quiet in a way that hurt me without him meaning it to. I don't know if that's forgiveness, but it's not anger anymore either. It's just understanding finally why a good man sometimes makes a choice that costs somebody he loves more than he realises. And Pruitt, Callie said, is a different question entirely. I intend to answer it Thursday in front of the whole town. Denise insisted on the dinner, 3 nights before the hearing. Callie almost said no. The last thing she wanted, that particular week, was to sit at a table with people whose motives she had to weigh, but Denise had already invited half the family, including their Uncle Frank, who worked awkwardly enough as a loan processor at the same bank branch handling Roger Pruitt's note. Callie understood, once she thought about it. The dinner was less a social obligation than an opportunity Wendell would have told her not to waste. You're quiet tonight, Frank said, over pot roast midway through the meal. Everything all right with the diner business? Fine, Callie said, keeping her voice light, the way Wendell had coached her. Innocent curiosity over anything sharper. Just trying to understand how these zoning things usually go. You work with a lot of developers, don't you, Frank? Through the bank? Frank, 3 beers into the evening and never one to resist talking about his work, nodded readily. Sure, plenty. Why? I heard a name, Callie said, watching him carefully. Pruitt. Roger Pruitt. Somebody at church mentioned he's got some big land deal going on Route 9. Frank's easy expression flickered, just slightly. The particular tell of a man who knows more than he's supposed to say. He was deciding in real time whether pot roast and family loyalty outweighed his professional discretion. I probably shouldn't talk about a customer's business, Frank said slowly. Of course not, Callie said, and let the silence sit exactly as long as Wendell had taught her silence should sit, neither pushing nor releasing it. I'll just say, Frank said finally, lowering his voice even though it was only family at the table, that fella's covenant deadline is a lot closer than most folks think. The branch manager isn't in a real forgiving mood anymore. If his deal doesn't close clean by year's end, the whole note comes due at once. That kind of thing happens. Sometimes a man's whole empire comes apart over one parcel he was sure he already had in the bag. Denise caught Callie's eye across the table. Callie kept her face carefully, deliberately neutral, filing the confirmation away exactly as Wendell had told her to. Without reaction. Without tipping the hand she was quietly building toward Thursday. That does sound stressful for him, Callie said mildly, and reached for the rolls. The conversation moved on to Cousin Beth's wedding plans. Nobody at that table except Denise understood what had just happened. Callie Jean Whitmore had just confirmed something, from a source with no reason to lie. Exactly how much pressure was bearing down on the man trying to take her father's diner. She called Wendell that same night to tell him what Frank had said. Year's end deadline, Wendell repeated. That confirms it. He's not just trying to beat you to a hearing date. He's trying to beat a calendar. That's useful to know, Callie. A man racing a calendar makes mistakes a patient man never would. Should we use it? Bring it up at the hearing? No, Wendell said firmly. You don't need his desperation to win this. You need your daddy's deed and my filing, and the county's own stamp. His desperation is just the reason he's about to lose badly instead of losing quietly. Let the record do the work. Save Frank's information for your own peace of mind, not for the podium. 2 days before the hearing, Callie drove out to the old drive-in theatre lot on the edge of town, not for any reason connected to the diner. Danny had proposed to her there 7 years earlier, on a blanket in the truck bed, under a screen that hadn't shown a film in a decade. She stood in that overgrown lot, the ticket booth's broken window catching the last of the daylight. She found she could finally think about him, without the grief closing her throat entirely. I wish you could see this, she said out loud, to the empty lot. The way she'd once said, "Okay, Dad, I'm counting," to an empty diner. I wish you could see what I found. I think you'd have liked Wendell. I think you'd have told me I was brave. And I think for once, you might have been right. She drove back to town as the sun went down, past the diner, its window lit for the first time in years by a single working bulb she'd replaced herself. Past the property line, where Wendell's frontage stake still stood, marking in plain wood and paint exactly where the truth had always been waiting for somebody to measure it correctly. That night, sorting the last of her documents into Wendell's leather folder, Callie set the old photograph on top, the one Sharon Tolliver had given her parents standing together beside a survey stake in 1994, closest to hand. Some evidence, she'd decided, deserved to be seen before it was merely read. She slept, that final night before the hearing, better than she had in 11 months. Not because the fear was gone, but because for the first time since a state trooper's gentle voice had rewritten her whole life in April, she understood something, exactly what she was walking into, and exactly why she was going to walk out of it standing taller than she'd walked in. Wendell's kitchen table, by the night before the hearing, looked like the evidence room of a trial nobody had officially called a trial yet. The 1994 deed, the certified copy of the county filing, Delbert Combs's seal stamped fresh in the corner, the ledger open to the page where Vera Whitmore's handwriting first appeared, and beside all of it, the popcorn tin. Empty now of its key, but kept anyway. Some objects earn a permanent seat at the table. They'll let you speak for 3 minutes, Wendell said. Town ordinance, public comment, 3 minutes per resident, no exceptions. Even for the family whose whole life is sitting in a filing cabinet in that room. 3 minutes, Callie repeated. It's enough, Wendell said, if you say the right things in the right order. You don't argue with the board, you don't raise your voice at Pruitt, no matter what he says up there. You state the record. Plain. Let the paper do what paper does. It outlasts every argument a man can make about it. Callie practiced that night at Denise's kitchen table, reading the key lines aloud until they stopped feeling like a speech. Until they started feeling like the truth they were. Wendell had told her that was the whole trick of it. A rehearsed truth still lands as a truth. He'd told her. It's only rehearsed lies that people can smell coming. Denise sat across from her, arms crossed, worry etched plain on her face, the way it had been etched there since April. What if the board just doesn't listen? What if they have already decided, and this is just a formality before they hand him the parcel anyway? Then I'll have said it anyway, Callie said, and it'll be in the public record. Whatever they decide, a decision made against a public record that says otherwise doesn't stay standing very long. Mr. Pruitt's told me that twice now, and I believe him. She did not sleep well that night, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than she'd carried the 11 months since April. That grief had felt like drowning, slow and total, no bottom to touch. This felt like standing at the top of a ladder she'd built herself, rung by rung, out of a floor tile and a popcorn tin, and a mother she'd only just learned to grieve properly. The morning of the hearing, Callie opened the diner for 2 hours. Closing it, she'd decided, would look like fear. She'd promised herself somewhere in the last 3 weeks that she was done looking like anything other than exactly what she was. 23 customers came through that morning, more than any single day since she'd reopened. 3 of them told her, unprompted, that they remembered her mother. An older woman with a church casserole dish. 2 men in county work vests. Vera used to slip me an extra biscuit when I was short a quarter, the older woman said. She set a $5 bill on the counter for a $2 coffee and waved off the change. Best woman this town ever had behind a register. You've got her hands, you know that. Way you hold the pot. Callie's eyes stung, and she let them, right there at the counter. Grief that finally has somewhere honest to land isn't something to hide from customers who loved the same people you did. By 6:30 that evening, the Marrow Creek Town Hall parking lot was fuller than Callie had ever seen it. Trucks and sedans lined up 2 rows deep along Main Street, more cars than the building's small lot could hold. Word had moved through town exactly the way Wendell had predicted it would, quiet and certain. It seemed like half of Marrow Creek had decided a zoning hearing about one diner was worth a Thursday evening. Inside, the meeting room held maybe 80 folding chairs, and by 7 o'clock, every one of them was filled. A line of people stood along the back wall. Callie recognised faces from 31 years of counter service. Church members, county workers, a few of Danny's old co-workers. They'd come, she understood, simply because they'd loved him, and by extension loved her. Denise sat in the second row, gripping Callie's hand like she meant to keep her upright by force if it came to that. Wendell sat on Callie's other side, a leather folder of documents squared neatly on his lap. He looked in his good jacket, like a man 20 years younger than he'd looked in his kitchen doorway 3 weeks earlier. Roger Pruitt sat at the front, at a table set up for petitioners. A lawyer beside him, a stack of papers considerably thicker than anything Callie was carrying. He did not look at her when she came in. He looked instead at the zoning board members filing into their seats, the way a man looks at people he's already spent considerable effort convincing. The board chair was a heavy-set man named Alvin Ketch. He ran the hardware store on weekdays and chaired the zoning board on the side. He gavelled the meeting, open at 7 sharp. We're here tonight, Ketch said, reading from a prepared statement, to consider a hardship petition filed by Pruitt Regional Development, requesting an emergency blight determination and public purchase authorization for the parcel at 4,471 Route 9, currently held by Callie Jean Whitmore. Roger's lawyer stood first and spoke for nearly 15 minutes. He described the property in language that made Callie's childhood home sound like a condemned hazard. Not a building her mother had kept books for. Not a building her father had poured coffee in for 3 decades. Structural concerns. Extended vacancy. A photograph came up on a screen at the front of the room. The diner's peeling exterior paint. The sagging gutter. Taken, Callie noted, from the least flattering angle available. The town has a clear interest, the lawyer concluded, in resolving this blighted property swiftly for the benefit of the corridor's broader economic development, of which Pruitt Regional Development stands ready to be a primary partner. Alvin Ketch nodded, made a note and turned to the room. We'll now open the floor for public comment. 3 minutes per speaker, please. I'll ask everyone to keep remarks relevant to the petition at hand. 2 of Roger's own site managers spoke first. They echoed the blight language with a practiced ease. It told Callie they'd been coached on exactly what to say. Then Alvin Ketch called the next name on his sign-up sheet. Callie Whitmore. Callie stood and felt 80 pairs of eyes shift toward her at once. For one long second she was 9 years old again, standing on a milk crate, learning to tip a coffee pot at exactly 45 degrees so it never dripped. She walked to the small podium set up at the front of the room, Wendell's leather folder in her hands. She set it down carefully before she spoke, the way her father had taught her to set anything down that mattered. My name is Callie Jean Whitmore, she said, and her voice did not shake, which surprised her more than it surprised anyone watching. My father, Ray Whitmore, opened that diner in 1994. My mother, Vera Whitmore, kept its books for 10 years alongside him, a fact I only learned 3 weeks ago, because my father loved her too much to tell me how recently he'd lost her. I buried my husband 11 months ago. I buried my father 3 years before that. I have $340 in my checking account. Until 3 weeks ago, I believed this town's map told the whole truth about what I owned. She paused, and the room, which had been shifting and murmuring through the earlier testimony, went very still. "It doesn't," Callie said, "and I have the paper to prove it." She opened the leather folder and lifted out the first document. She held it up so the board could see it, though she read from it rather than passing it forward yet. "This is my father's original deed to the parcel, at 4471 Route 9, she said, recorded March 14th, 1994. It describes a property boundary running 40 feet past the line this town's current survey map shows. For weeks I didn't understand why that discrepancy existed. I do now." She nodded, and Wendell Pruitt rose from his seat beside Denise. Folder in hand, he walked to stand beside her at the podium. A murmur ran through the room, the recognition of a familiar face in an unfamiliar role. "Some of you know me," Wendell said, his voice carrying easily to the back wall without needing to be raised. "I surveyed half the parcels on this stretch of Route 9 over 40 years before I retired. In March of 1994, Ray Whitmore paid me, in pie, to mark the true boundary of his parcel before the foundation pour. I filed that survey myself at the county records office, 2 full years before this town conducted the boundary survey. Everyone here has been treating as the final word ever since." He held up the certified copy Delbert Combs had sealed for them at the courthouse. "This is that filing," Wendell said. "Certified this month by the county records office. It matches, line for line, the deed Mrs. Whitmore just showed you. It was never lost. It was never in dispute. It was sitting in a bound volume in a basement on Main Street the entire time. Nobody thought to look for a filing older than the map they'd already decided was correct." Alvin Ketch leaned forward, frowning at the certified copy Wendell passed up to the board table. "Mr. Pruitt, are you saying the county's current boundary survey is simply wrong?" "I'm saying it's incomplete," Wendell said. "It never accounted for a prior recorded filing. That's not an unusual thing to happen in a county this size, over 40 years, with paper records instead of digital ones. It is, however, a very easy thing to correct. Once somebody puts the 2 documents side by side, which is exactly what you're holding right now." A ripple moved through the crowd, low and immediate, the sound of 80 people doing the same arithmetic at roughly the same speed. Roger Pruitt had gone very still at the petitioner's table. His lawyer leaned towards him with a whisper Callie couldn't hear. She could read it plainly enough in the tightening of Roger's jaw. "If this filing is accurate," Ketch said slowly, looking up from the document, "then the 40 feet of frontage described in the assembly plans, submitted by Pruitt Regional Development, belongs to my client," Callie said, before she could stop herself and then caught herself. She softened it because Wendell had told her plain beats sharp. "Every time. Belongs to me. Not the town. Not Pruitt Regional Development. Me under a deed my father recorded and my mother paid to file. 30 years before anyone in this room started measuring this corridor for a bypass exchange." Roger's lawyer stood abruptly. "Mr. Chairman, this is highly irregular. Introducing county documents at a public hearing. Without proper..." "Every document Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Pruitt have presented," Ketch said, cutting him off. He had the flat authority of a man who ran a hardware store and did not enjoy being lectured at. "Is a certified public record from this county's own office. I'd say that's about as proper as documents get, Councillor." The room laughed, a short release of tension that seemed to loosen something in the air itself. Callie felt for the first time in the whole evening the crowd's weight shift visibly toward her. "Mr. Pruitt," Ketch said, turning to the petitioner's table, "your assembly plan and your pre-sale agreement, as filed with this board, both assume a parcel boundary. This new evidence directly contradicts it. Do you have anything to add before this board deliberates?" Roger stood slowly. For one long moment, Callie watched a man who had spent 20 years being the most certain person in every room he entered. She watched him discover, in real time, in front of half his town, that certainty and correctness were not the same thing. The assembly plan, Roger said, his voice usually so smooth, had a rough edge Callie hadn't heard in it before, was drawn up in good faith, based on the survey information available to my firm at the time. "Available," Wendell said quietly, not unkindly, or convenient. Roger didn't answer that. He sat back down and his lawyer leaned in again. This time the whisper between them had the particular urgency of men calculating how much worse the evening could still get. Alvin Ketch conferred briefly with the other 4 board members, a low exchange Callie couldn't follow. Then he straightened and addressed the room. Given the certified documentation just presented, Ketch said, "This board cannot in good conscience find grounds for an emergency blight determination, not on a parcel whose true boundary and ownership are now in clear dispute, resolved in favour of the current deed holder. The petition filed by Pruitt Regional Development is hereby tabled, pending a formal review and correction of the county's boundary survey to reflect the 1994 filing. Mrs. Whitmore's ownership of the full parcel, including the disputed frontage, stands unchallenged by this board tonight." The gavel came down, sharp and final. The room broke into the low, buzzing murmur of 80 people already turning to their neighbours to talk it through. Callie Jean Whitmore stood at the podium with her father's deed in one hand and her mother's filing fee finally paid off, 30 years late, in front of the exact town that had watched her bury a husband and inherit what everyone assumed was nothing at all. She did not gloat. She did not look at Roger Pruitt with anything more than the plain, level attention she'd have given any stranger. She simply gathered the documents back into Wendell's leather folder and closed it. Then she said quietly, mostly to herself, the 4 words her father had left folded in a popcorn tin. "Count carefully," she murmured. "I did, Dad." Roger Pruitt left the town hall before the room had finished clearing. His lawyer trailed behind him with the stack of now useless assembly plans. He did not look back at the table, where Callie stood accepting handshakes from neighbours who remembered her mother's biscuits and her father's coffee pour. Within the week, word would move through Marrow Creek, quiet and certain as always. His bank had called the note on the land assembly the moment the truck stop chain withdrew its pre-sale agreement. The deal had collapsed the instant the parcel boundary shifted out from under it, but that was still to come. That night, standing in the town hall with Wendell's hand steady on her shoulder, Denise crying openly in the second row, Callie Jean Whitmore understood only one thing. She had walked into that room a widow with $340 and a dollar bill inheritance everyone had laughed about. She was walking out as the sole, undisputed, certified owner of the single most valuable half-acre on Route 9. Her mother, dead 17 years, had made sure of it, with a filing fee paid out of her own purse the week her daughter was born. "He knew this day would come," Wendell said quietly, as they walked out into the parking lot together. The autumn air was sharp and clean after the crowded room. "Your daddy. He built the whole thing to hold exactly like this, exactly this, long after he was gone. Did he know it'd take a floor tile and a popcorn tin to get me to look?" Callie asked. Wendell smiled, the first real smile she'd seen on him all evening. "Callie, he knew you'd only look when you were ready. That's why he waited to tell you. Some doors a father doesn't open for you. He just leaves the key close enough that you'll find it the day you finally need it." Roger Pruitt's bank called his note 11 days after the hearing, exactly as Frank had predicted at that pot roast dinner. The truck stop chain's pre-sale agreement collapsed the same week. Their own attorneys reviewed the amended county boundary survey. They confirmed the assembly no longer included the frontage the whole deal had depended on. Pruitt Regional Development's other parcels along Route 9 went up for a distressed sale within the month. The golf shirt men and their clicking tape measures replaced almost overnight by real estate agents' modest yard signs. Callie heard about most of it secondhand, the same patient grapevine that had carried every piece of news through Marrow Creek since the reading of her father's will. She found to her own mild surprise that she felt no triumph in it, just a settling, the quiet satisfaction of watching a scale finally balance after months of watching it tip the wrong way. She saw Roger Pruitt once more, 3 weeks after the hearing, at the county records office of all places. Both of them there on entirely separate business. He stopped when he saw her instead of walking past. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and something in his voice had lost its old smoothness entirely, replaced by something plainer, more tired. "I owe you an apology, maybe more than one." Callie studied him a moment. He looked older than he had at the diner counter, the expensive haircut a little overgrown now, the confidence that had carried him through 20 years of aggressive land deals visibly dented. "You knew the parcel line was in dispute," she said. "Before the hearing, didn't you?" He didn't deny it. "I had a suspicion," he admitted. "My own surveyor flagged an inconsistency early on. I told him to proceed with the original assembly plan anyway. I needed the deal to close before my note came due. I told myself it was a technicality that would resolve itself in my favour. I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that cost you 11 days of a hearing you shouldn't have had to sit through at all, right after burying your husband and your father both. Why tell me now? Callie asked. The deal's already dead. You don't owe me anything anymore. Because you didn't gloat, Roger said. At the hearing. You could have. Half that room would have cheered you for it, and I deserved it. You just read the record and sat back down. That stuck with me more than I expected it to. Callie considered him a long moment. The particular pause Wendell had taught her carried more weight than any quick reply. I'm not interested in your ruin, Mr. Pruitt, she said finally. I was only ever interested in the truth standing up. What you do with what's left of your business is your business. But here's one piece of advice from a woman who spent 11 months learning this lesson the hard way. Build the next thing on ground you've actually checked, not ground you're hoping nobody else checks first. He nodded slowly, something that might have been genuine humility crossing his face for the first time since she'd met him. That's fair, he said. More than fair. He hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, your father's diner was always the best-run business on that corridor. He even shuttered 3 years. I looked at the old health inspection records once, trying to find grounds for the blight petition. Never found a single violation in 31 years. I've never seen a file that clean. It was, Callie understood, as close to a genuine tribute as Roger Pruitt knew how to give. She accepted it as one. The diner's grand reopening 3 weeks later was not grand in any way Callie had planned for. She'd meant it to be quiet, a Saturday morning like any other. But half of Marrow Creek showed up anyway, drawn by the same patient grapevine that had carried every other piece of this story through town. Wendell arrived early to help set up extra tables borrowed from the church hall. Sharon Tolliver came with a fresh apron. She offered, unprompted, to work the register the way she once had for Vera. Delbert Combs came on his lunch break from the courthouse. Alvin Ketch stopped by after opening the hardware store. Even Frank showed up, sheepish about his loose tongue at Denise's dinner table. He grinned anyway when Callie hugged him and told him his loose tongue had helped more than he knew. Above the door, where a faded sign had once simply read, Whitmore's, Callie hung a new one, hand-lettered by a sign painter 2 towns over, using paint she'd paid for out of the diner's first week of honest profit. It read, Whitmore's EST 1994, Ray Vera. She stood under it the morning of the reopening, coffee pot in hand. Sie got Effie and Mara. She poured the first cup for Wendell Pruitt at exactly the angle her father had taught her on a milk crate at 9 years old. She watched him drink it without a single drop landing on the counter. Your daddy would be proud of this place, Wendell said, setting the cup down. But I think he'd be prouder of you. He left me the key, Callie said. I just had to be ready to find it. That's the whole trick of inheritance. In my experience, Wendell said, the people who love us best don't hand us the answer. They just make sure the door's unlocked. For the day we're finally strong enough to walk through it ourselves. The morning after the reopening, Callie drove to the bank 2 towns over. Not to Roger Pruitt's branch, but to a small credit union Wendell had recommended, to open a proper business account for the first time since her father's death. The loan officer there, a young woman named Priya Nair, looked at the deed and the amended survey with open curiosity. I heard about the hearing, Priya said, sliding paperwork across her desk. My aunt was in the crowd that night. She said you didn't even raise your voice once. Didn't need to, Callie said. The paper did the raising for me. Priya smiled and got to work setting up the account. Within the hour, Callie walked out with a checkbook bearing the name Whitmore's Family Diner, the first official document, she realised, that had ever put her mother's contribution into the business's actual legal bones. Callie had insisted on listing the account jointly under both her parents' names as founders, even though only one of them had lived long enough to see this version of the diner reopen. Back on Route 9, the work of an ordinary week resumed with a steadiness Callie found she'd missed without knowing it. Sharon Tolliver's granddaughter, a bright, quick 19-year-old named Josie, learned the register faster than Callie had expected. Within a month, she'd started tipping the coffee pot at the same careful angle, unprompted. She'd watched Callie do it enough times that the habit simply transferred itself. The way certain disciplines do, from one careful pair of hands to the next. Gary Iverson, the contractor, came back twice more that spring. Once to reinforce the old grease trap. Once, unbidden, to repair the sagging gutter that had been photographed so unflatteringly at the zoning hearing. He refused payment for the second job entirely. "Your daddy pulled me out of a burning barn in 1988, he told her when she tried to insist. "A gutter's the least I owe that man's daughter." Callie began keeping her own ledger that spring. A fresh one, its first page dated the day of the reopening. She made a private rule for herself, one she never announced to anyone but Wendell. Every entry, however small, got written in full. Never abbreviated, never left for memory to fill in later. She had learned, the hard way, how much a family could lose, simply because nobody wrote the whole truth down where the next generation could find it. She thought some mornings, restocking the pie case before the sun was fully up, about the version of this same room 3 years earlier. Dust settling evenly over every surface. A photograph of two people squinting into a sun that had already set. She thought about how close she had come to selling it all to Roger Pruitt for $9,000, out of simple exhaustion. How easily grief could have made that decision for her. If Wendell Pruitt hadn't answered his door, the day she showed up holding a rusted popcorn tin like it might still be hot. "You ever regret not selling quick and getting it over with?" Denise asked her once, that spring. She was watching Callie restock napkin dispensers with the same unhurried care their father once brought to the same task. "Every day I don't regret it," Callie said. "I understand a little more why he left it to me, instead of just telling me what was in the floor." By early summer, Whitmore's had become, without any deliberate marketing on Callie's part, something of a local landmark again. Truckers detoured off the interstate specifically for the pie. Church groups booked the back tables for Sunday lunch after service. A slow trickle of curious strangers had heard some version of the story, second-hand. They wanted to see, for themselves, the counter where a woman had found a fortune under a cracked floor tile. Callie never told the story to customers the way the grapevine had shaped it. All drama and reversal. When people asked, she told it plainer than that, closer to what it had actually felt like from the inside. A scared, grieving woman on her knees with a pie server. A neighbour who remembered more than anyone thought to ask him. A mother whose handwriting had been waiting patiently in a ledger margin for 17 years to finally be read. It wasn't luck, she told a young reporter from the county paper. He'd come out that summer to do a small feature on the diner's reopening. It was two people who loved me enough to build something that could still hold me up long after they were both gone. I just had to be paying attention. Autumn wasn't the only season that changed at Whitmore's that year. Winter tested it too, and tested it hard. A pipe burst in late January, the coldest week Marrow Creek had seen in a decade. Callie found it at 5 a.m, water pooling under the pie case, right over the spot where the safe still sat sealed and dry beneath the concrete. She called Gary Iverson before the sun came up. He didn't complain. He just said, "Give me 20 minutes," and he meant it. "Lucky the safe's watertight," he told her, kneeling over the mess with a wrench in his hand. "Your daddy built that whole footing like he expected a flood someday." Guess he wasn't wrong. "He built a lot of things like he expected trouble," Callie said. "Guess I finally understand why. They got the pipe fixed by 7. The floor dried by noon." Callie opened 2 hours late. Not one regular complained. By then, half of Marrow Creek understood exactly what kind of year this diner had already survived. Josie handled the morning rush alone while Callie mopped. She did it without a single order coming back wrong. It told Callie the girl had more of her grandmother in her than either of them had guessed. Sharon would be proud, Callie told her, at closing. "She already is," Josie said. "She just likes to make me guess." Spring brought a different kind of test. A national diner chain scouted the corridor that April, sniffing around the same frontage Roger Pruitt once wanted, offering considerably more money than Roger ever had. Their regional buyer, a smooth young man named Dean Castle, showed up unannounced on a Tuesday with a folder of his own. "We'd keep the name if you wanted," Dean said, sliding a card across the counter. "Whitmore's, franchise branded. You'd never have to work another shift in your life." Callie looked at the card a long moment, the way Wendell had taught her to look at anything that mattered. "I don't want to stop working shifts," she said. "That's the part you're offering to take away." Dean blinked, clearly unused to that answer. "It's a very generous number, Mrs. Whitmore." "I know it is," Callie said, But some things aren't for sale twice. My father sold this place to me for $1, so it would never have to be sold to anyone else again. I intend to keep it that way." She slid the card back across the counter. Dean left without pushing, the way men do when they realise a number isn't going to be the thing that moves someone. Wendell heard about it that same evening and laughed so hard he had to set his coffee down. "Your daddy," he said, "would have loved watching you say no to real money for the second time in 1 year." "Feels different than it used to," Callie admitted. "Saying no used to scare me. Now it just feels like telling the truth." By the second summer, the diner had settled into something steadier than either Callie or Wendell had quite expected. Regulars had regulars of their own now. Whole families who'd started coming because their neighbours had started coming. The particular momentum a small-town business builds once trust replaces curiosity. Callie kept the ledger faithfully, every entry written out in full the way she'd promised herself. She kept the bond money mostly untouched, aside from the pantry loan and a new roof the diner badly needed. She kept Danny's photograph exactly where it had always been. And she kept most of all the habit her father gave her at 9 years old, the exact 45-degree tilt of a coffee pot. She poured for strangers and neighbours alike with the same unhurried care, as if the whole secret of a good life were really that simple, as if it had been waiting under a cracked floor tile the entire time, for her to finally believe it. Denise moved out of her own cramped rental that second summer, into a small house 2 streets over from the diner close enough to walk. Callie helped her with the down payment. Not out of pity. Out of the plain math of 2 sisters who had carried each other through the worst year of both their lives. They'd earned, each of them, an easier one. "You don't have to do this," Denise said, standing in the empty living room of the new place, boxes still stacked by the door. "I know I don't," Callie said. "I want to. There's a difference." Denise hugged her hard enough to lift her half off the floor. Neither of them said anything else about it. Some gifts don't need a speech to land. Callie's own life that second year took on a shape she hadn't expected grief to ever leave room for. She started seeing a man named Curtis Boyle. Gently, slowly. A lineman for the county power company. He came into the diner most Wednesdays. Always ordered the same thing. Always tipped exactly right. He never once asked her to explain Danny or Ray or Vera or any of it. He just let her tell it in her own time, in her own order, the way she'd learned to tell everything since the hearing. "You don't talk about yourself much," she told him once, over coffee after closing. "Figured you had enough people wanting things explained to you this year," Curtis said. "Didn't want to be one more." She thought about that a long time after he left that night, turning it over the way she used to turn over things that hurt to hold, except this one didn't hurt at all. Wendell walked her down the aisle himself, 18 months later. Callie and Curtis married in a small ceremony behind the diner, string lights strung between the porch posts. The whole town of Marrow Creek crowded onto folding chairs, borrowed once again from the church hall. "Your daddy would want this job," Wendell told her before the music started, "but I expect he'd forgive me for taking it." "He'd have liked you best of anybody," Callie said. "You found me the truth. That's the only wedding gift that ever really counted. In this family." Wendell's eyes went wet at that. He didn't try to hide it. He walked her down a short aisle of folding chairs to a groom who tipped his hat instead of his hand. Some habits, it turned out, really did run in families that had never once shared a drop of blood. The diner kept its name. The diner kept its hours. The diner kept, above all, the sign that read, Whitmore's, EST, 1994, Ray Vera. It weathered season after season into something that looked less like new paint, more like a fact the whole county had simply always known. The third autumn brought one more visitor Callie hadn't expected. A young woman, maybe 22, hesitated at the diner's door one slow Tuesday afternoon, a folder clutched to her chest, the same way Sharon Tolliver had once carried hers. "Mrs. Whitmore," the young woman said. "My name's Abby Combs. Delbert Combs is my grandfather. He told me to bring you this." Inside the folder was a copy of the amended county boundary map, officially recorded. Callie's frontage drawn in clean black ink, exactly where her father's 1994 filing had always said it belonged. "Grandpa said every property owner on this stretch got sent one," Abby said, "but he wanted to bring yours himself. Only he's got a bad hip these days, so he sent me instead." Callie took the map and held it a long moment. She felt the particular weight of it, a truth finally made permanent on paper that would outlive every person who'd fought over it. "Tell your grandfather thank you," Callie said. "Tell him I said the map finally caught up to the truth." Abby smiled. "He said you'd say something like that." She left with a slice of pie on the house. Callie pinned the amended map to the wall behind the register, right beside her parents' photograph, right beside Danny's. A fourth small witness added to a wall that had slowly become the truest ledger the diner kept. Curtis found her there that evening, studying the wall the way she sometimes did at closing. He slipped an arm around her shoulder without a word. "Good day?" he asked. "Good day," Callie said. "The best kind." Nothing happened at all, and everything stayed exactly where it belonged. He laughed at that, low and warm. They closed up together, the way they always did now. The register counted twice, out of old habit rather than necessity. Hope no longer needing the recount it once had. Outside, Route 9 ran quiet under a sky going orange at the edges. The same road that had once carried a lawyer's dismissive letter and a developer's clicking tape measure. Now it carried nothing more dramatic than the occasional truck slowing for pie. Callie locked the door, the same groan as always. She stood a moment on the gravel with Curtis beside her, looking back at a building that had outlasted every person who'd ever doubted it, herself included. "Your dad really built something," Curtis said. "My mum and dad both did," Callie said. "That's the part I almost never got to know, and now I get to keep telling it. Every single day, to anybody who walks through that door, wondering if the worthless thing they were handed might actually be worth something after all." The savings bonds matured out at just over $400,000. Wendell walked her through a financial advisor in the county seat to confirm it. 30 years of compounding interest. Ray and Vera Whitmore had apparently intended it, all along, as a cushion for exactly the kind of year Callie had just survived. The land's value came in on top of that, once the county formally amended the boundary survey. Alvin Ketch's board approved the amendment unanimously the month after the hearing. For the first time in her adult life, Callie found herself without the particular daily terror of counting dollars against a bill due before Friday. She did not quit the truck stop right away. She kept her shifts there 3 more weeks, partly out of stubbornness, partly because the manager, a decent woman named Patrice, deserved proper notice. Patrice had covered for Callie more than once during the worst of her grief. A woman doesn't disappear on someone like that the moment money stops being a daily emergency. Callie gave her notice eventually, on good terms, and Patrice cried a little at the register on Callie's last shift, which surprised them both. The diner itself took most of the winter to bring fully back to code. Callie hired a contractor, recommended by Wendell, a quiet man named Gary Iverson, who'd known Ray Whitmore from the volunteer fire department. He charged her, she suspected, considerably less than his usual rate, out of respect for the man who'd once pulled him out of a burning barn. The health inspector, who finally renewed the permit, turned out to be the same inspector Roger Pruitt's petition had cited as a potential source of blight concerns. He laughed out loud when he saw the kitchen, spotless and rebuilt to standards higher than the code required. "Whoever told the zoning board this place was a hazard?" the inspector said, signing the permit. Clearly never actually walked through it. By spring, Whitmore's was serving 40 covers a day. More business than the diner had done in its final years, before Ray's health declined. Callie had hired 2 waitresses. One of them was Sharon Tolliver's granddaughter. She took to the register with an ease that made Callie wonder, not for the first time, whether some kinds of steadiness simply ran in certain families, the way Eye Colour did. She used part of the bond money the way she suspected her father would have wanted. She paid off the small church loan on the Baptist food pantry on Kettle Road. Quietly, through Wendell, who delivered the payment without naming its source, Callie had decided early that this particular kindness didn't need her name attached to it, no more than the popcorn tin had needed an explanation 30 years ago. She set up a standing arrangement with the diner's supplier too, donating the week's unsold pies to the same pantry every Sunday. It was a habit that had actually started with her father, informally, in his last working years. Callie simply made it official and permanent. She thought often that first year about the woman who had walked out of the lawyer's office, a folded dollar bill in hand, nowhere left to belong. She could look back at that woman now with something closer to tenderness than pity. That woman hadn't known yet what grief does Given enough time and enough honest work, it doesn't disappear, but it does eventually make room for something else, to grow up alongside it. Danny's memory found its own place in the new life too. It wasn't shoved aside to make room for the diner's demands. It got woven into it instead, the way grief eventually learns to weave itself into anything that keeps moving forward. She kept a single photograph of him behind the register, small, unobtrusive, beside her parents' larger one. When customers asked about the handsome young man in the picture, she told them plainly, he had been her husband. She had loved him completely. And some part of the strength it took to fight for this diner had come straight from him. From the strength he'd shown her once, holding her hand in a hospital waiting room, simply refusing to let go. Wendell Pruitt became, over that first year, something between a business advisor and a surrogate grandfather. A role he settled into with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He came by most mornings. He still refused every cup of coffee Callie tried to give him for free. He insisted on paying full price. A business that gives away its coffee to old surveyors won't stay a business very long, he said. Callie let him have that dignity. A man who had spent his whole working life making sure things were measured correctly. Still measuring. Still making sure the accounts balanced, even in the smallest transaction of a single cup of coffee. Roger Pruitt's development company did not survive the year. His remaining Route 9 parcels sold off piecemeal. He took eventually a salaried position with a regional planning commission 2 counties over. Callie heard about it through the grapevine, and it felt closer to relief than satisfaction. She hoped in the plain way she'd learned to hope for things since the hearing, that he'd actually learned something, from the ground giving way under him, not just moved on to the next parcel he hadn't properly checked. On the 1-year anniversary of the will reading, Callie closed the diner early. She hung a small sign reading, "Back at 4." She drove out to the cemetery, where her father, and she now understood, her mother, both rested, side by side, under a headstone that had always struck her as unusually large. For a man everyone in the family considered to have died with almost nothing, she sat on the grass between the 2 graves for a long while. The autumn light slanted low, the way it had the day the lawyer slid a single dollar bill across his desk. She told them both, out loud, everything that had happened since. The tile, the tin, the key, the safe, the bonds, the hearing, the sign above the door that finally carried both their names instead of just his. "I found her," Callie said, to her father's marker specifically. "I found Mom in that ledger, and I understand now why you never told me the timeline right. I'm not angry anymore. I think I understand what it cost you to carry that alone." She placed a single fresh biscuit from the diner's morning batch on her mother's side of the stone, an offering that made sense only to her, to Carr, a callback to the biscuit Sharon Tolliver once described her mother slipping to a customer short a quarter. On her father's side, she placed the same folded dollar bill the lawyer had handed her that first terrible morning. The bill she had carried in her coat pocket through every discovery since. "You said count carefully," she told them both. "I did. I counted the tiles. I counted the years I didn't know about. I counted every dollar you both quietly put aside, so I'd never have to be as scared as I was that first morning. It was never about the money. It was always about you making sure I'd know, eventually, that I was never as alone as grief made it feel." She drove back to the diner before 4. She reopened the door with its same familiar groan. She poured coffee for the regulars who'd started drifting in, the moment the sign flipped. She tipped the pot at exactly 45 degrees, the way a father had taught a daughter on a milk crate. The way, she now knew, a mother had likely taught that same father, years before that. Above the door, the sign read, "Whitmore's, EST, 1994, Ray Vera." It weathered a little more gracefully with each passing season. Inside, a woman poured coffee. Once she'd owned nothing but a single dollar and a diner everyone called worthless. Now she poured for a town that had watched her lose almost everything. And then, tile by tile, count her way back to everything that mattered. The popcorn tin still sat on a shelf behind the register, empty now of its key but never moved. A small rusted witness to the morning, a locked room finally opened. Autumn came around again faster than Callie expected. The corn in the fields along Route 9 turned the same gold it had turned the year everything changed. The diner marked its first full year back in business on a Saturday morning. It felt in every ordinary way exactly like the Saturdays that had come before it that whole year, which was its own kind of victory. Denise brought her kids by that morning. They sat in the same booth with the wobble in the third leg, the one Callie remembered from her own childhood. Gary Iverson had offered more than once to fix that wobble. Callie asked him, every time, to leave it exactly as it was. Some things, she told him, are supposed to still feel like the version you remember. Wendell arrived at his usual hour. He settled onto his usual stool. Callie poured his coffee at the usual angle, without either of them needing to comment on it anymore. The ritual had worn smooth by a full year of repetition. 1 year, Wendell said, looking around the diner. At Josie working the register. At the church group filling the back tables. At the new coat of paint on a building the county had once tried to call a hazard. Your daddy would say you did good, Callie. He wasn't a man who said it easy, but he'd say it. I know, Callie said. I think that's why he left the key instead of the words. He figured I'd trust the floor more than I'd have trusted a compliment. Wendell laughed at that, a real laugh, and drank his coffee. Outside the window a truck slowed on Route 9, the way trucks had started slowing all that year, drawn by nothing more than the smell of pie and coffee drifting out into the cold morning air. Exactly the way it always had. That evening, after the last customer left and Josie had gone home, the diner sat quiet the way it only sat once a day. Callie walked the length of the counter one final time before locking up. She ran her hand along the old formica the way her father must have, the way her mother must have before him. She stopped at the pie case. She knelt. She pressed her palm flat against the tile that had once been cracked and loose, now sealed properly, level with its neighbours, indistinguishable to anyone who didn't know its history. She did not say anything out loud this time. She simply rested her hand there a moment, the way you rest a hand on something that has already told you everything it needed to tell you. Then she stood, turned off the lights and locked the door behind her.